The Middle East Institute presents Claude Salhani discussing his book, While the World Slept, The Impact of the Bush Years on the Middle East. It gives me great pleasure to welcome editor and journalist Claude Salhani today for a preview of his latest book, While the Arab World Slept, The Impact of the Bush Years on the Middle East. We have copies downstairs for purchase. They're going for $30, and you can even get an autographed copy. And it's an enormously important subject because, of course, during the Bush years, America was more engaged in the Middle East than it has ever been before, from our war on terror to the war on Afghanistan to the war on Iraq. And, of course, we've been engaged in very militaristic ways. And during that time, the Middle East did not move forward. In fact, it sort of moved backwards. We saw a decline in human and political rights and minority rights, and possibly even women's rights. And the Bush years really unleashed unanticipated forces and sort of power shifts that we're still trying to understand today, and that's going to be the topic of Claude's discussion. He's the editor of the Middle East Times and a political analyst specializing in the Middle East and terrorism. He is a contributing editor to the commentary pages of the Washington Times, Dubai's Khalij Times, and Beirut's Executive Magazine, as well as the former editor of the Security and Terrorism Desk at the United Press International, UPI. Mr. Salhani has traveled the world, 78 countries at last count. Who's counting at that point? And he's covered 12 wars and interviewed most of the Middle East key players. And I should note he's been wounded in several of these wars. Anywhere that you can show us? And in addition to having his reports published in many of the world's major publications, he's the author of Black September to Desert Storm and a contributing author to the book The Iraq War. He was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the bombing of the U.S. barracks in Beirut, the U.S. Marine barracks. So please join me in welcoming Claude Salhani.
Thank you, Kate, for this very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here today, and it's quite an honor to be at the Middle East Institute. Let me preface what I'm going to say by stating the following, that my criticism of both the United States and the Middle East is done out of love for both countries, for both regions. In the opening pages of my book, I quote James Baldwin as saying, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact phrase, but he says something like, the reason he allows himself to criticize the United States is because of his great love for this country. And the same applies to me. I am originally from the Middle East, and I've been adopted by, and I have adopted the United States as my home, and I love both, thank you very much, and I love both regions, and therefore all the criticism that I have of both regions is done out of interest for the well-being of both regions. I want the Arab world to progress. I want the people of the Middle East, who deserve much better than they are currently getting, to live peaceful lives. History is rather strange when you look at it close up, and again, I quote Janet Flanner, who was a World War II correspondent for the New Yorker, who said, history is queer when you're standing close to it. And nothing seemed to justify the Bush years more than that statement, especially for someone like myself, who covered those years, 8 years, up close. There was never a shortage of material to write about as a commentator, as an analyst, following the Bush years. Unfortunately, the couple of days after I sent my manuscript to the printer, and it was too late to change anything, I had a sort of revelation, if you like, when I was invited to the Kurdish mission, which is not far from here. And they had a big party that they had invited a lot of people, and they had these flat screen TVs on the wall, and they were showing footage from major Kurdish cities in Iraqi Kurdistan, Erbil, Soleimani, and others. And it showed life as normal, and people were going about their regular lives, and the cities were booming, and they're building 5 major hotels in the region. And they attribute all this to George Bush. They've named avenues after him. They have posters of him all over the place, whereas in other parts of Iraq, they throw shoes at him. So I thought this was quite a paradox, and I thought that I regretted that, having not seen this before I sent my book to the printers, I would have added a few pages on that paradox, that history may yet remember Bush favorably if things develop in Iraq in a certain way. So that is the Bush paradox. Now, it's very difficult to talk about the Bush years without talking about the three wars and terrorism. The three wars are what Bush liked to call the war on terror, which I think is a misnomer because terror is an emotion. So, I call it the war on terrorism, which was not a war that the United States chose. It was a war that came to the United States with the attacks of September 11. The direct result from September 11th was, of course, the invasion of Afghanistan, which, if Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar thought was inevitable, they were either very naive or extremely bad at strategic planning. And, of course, there was the war in Iraq, which I think was a total waste of time and energy and resources and lives, that instead everything should have been concentrated on the real war, which was the war on terrorism. Some analysts in the United States trace the war on terrorism to 1983 with the attack of the Marine barracks in Beirut and the French contingent of the multinational force. 1983. However, I remember a Time magazine cover in 1977 that had across the cover war on terrorism. Now, in fact, to really see the you can pick any date as to when the war on terrorism started. I like to go back to 1967. 1967, the Arab-Israeli War, where in 6 days the Arabs lost a lot of territory, the Sinai, the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. But just as important, they lost face, they lost dignity in that war, and peace from then on would have been impossible unless they could have regained some of that, which was partially regained in the 73 Arab-Israeli War, when the Egyptians managed to take back the Sinai Peninsula. But in between those dates, there are two other very important dates. 1970, Black September, when the Palestinians fought a civil war with the Jordanians and were kicked out of Jordan and relocated in Lebanon. And, of course, 1973, which, as I said, was the Arab-Israeli War. But in between that, there is another very important date, which was 1971, when an Israeli commando force landed in Beirut and assassinated 3 Palestinians, Kamal Nasser, Kamal Adwan, and Abu Yusuf. I remember that incident very well for a number of reasons. First, it was led by a man by the name of Ehud Barak, who, as we know, went on to become prime minister. But I remember it for another reason. I was based in Beirut at the time, and it was midnight. I was in bed reading the diaries of Che Guevara, and I heard gunfire, which was unusual in Beirut in those days. So I thought at first it was my imagination because I was deeply involved in the jungles of Latin America, in the book at least. And then I heard more gunfire, so I called this taxi company that we had a contract with, that we used their cars, which was literally 30 seconds from my apartment building. The driver showed up. I told him to follow the sounds of the gunfire, and we made it to the corner of the street where the battle was still underway. Now, keep in mind, I had no idea what was going on, midnight, and the driver at one point said to me, he said, "Mr. Claude, this is as far as I go." So I said, "Okay, wait for me," and I started walking towards the gunfire, when all of a sudden I ran into a group of 15 armed men, who I assumed at the time were Palestinians. And the leader of the group said to me in Arabic, but with a funny accent, and again, remember, I was frightened, it was dark, I didn't know what I was doing, I didn't know who was where. And he said to me in Arabic, go back, it's dangerous here." So, and I was blocking actually their escape route. And I inched my way to the corner, and they ran towards 3 waiting cars and took off. And that was the Israeli commando team that had just assassinated the 3 Palestinian leaders.